Dad, I'm sorry, but I had to do it. Ethan's voice trembled as he sat across from Detective Harris in the brightly lit interrogation room. He held his head low, avoiding the detective's piercing gaze. His confession had sent shockwaves through the precinct. No one could believe what the timid 16-year-old had just revealed about his father. The door to the room burst open. Ethan's mother, Margaret, stormed in, her face pale and etched with fury. "Ethan, what have you done?" she cried. Ethan flinched but didn't raise his head. "I couldn't keep it a secret anymore, Mom. Someone had to know. It's wrong. Everything Dad did was wrong." Margaret froze as if struck by lightning. The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Detective Harris leaned forward. "Ethan, we need to act quickly. Are you ready to tell us where he's hiding?" Before Ethan could respond, the room's phone rang sharply, cutting through the tense silence. Detective Harris picked up, his expression darkening with every word spoken on the other end. He slammed the receiver down. "They found something," he said, his voice low. "And it's worse than we thought." Ethan had always looked up to his father. Charles Peterson was a man respected in their quiet suburban neighborhood of Green Meadows. With his warm smile and unshakable charm, he was the kind of man who'd show up at block parties with trays of barbecue ribs or volunteer at local fundraisers. To everyone, he was the perfect family man. But Ethan knew a side of his father that others didn't, a side he wished he could forget. It started 2 months ago when Ethan borrowed his father's laptop for a school project. Charles was out of town on a business trip, and Ethan's own laptop had stopped working. As he worked, an email notification popped up, marked as urgent. The sender's name didn't seem familiar, but the subject line read, "Payment confirmed, awaiting next instructions." Curiosity got the better of him. Ethan clicked on the email. What he saw made his stomach churn. A set of blueprints for a building he didn't recognize, followed by a list of people's names. Some were crossed out, with ominous notes like handled or delayed. At first, he thought it was some kind of prank. His father wasn't the type of man to be involved in anything shady, or so he thought. He scrolled further and discovered encrypted files, dozens of them, each labeled with strange codes. When he opened one, his blood ran cold. There were photos of people, some local, others strangers, accompanied by documents detailing their routines, addresses, and phone numbers. Ethan's heart raced. He tried convincing himself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe his father was doing some kind of undercover work, but deep down, he knew better. He shut the laptop and stayed awake all night, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. The following week, Ethan started noticing little things he had overlooked before. His father's late-night phone calls, the locked cabinet in the garage that Charles always guarded fiercely, the way he avoided certain questions when pressed. Then came the night Ethan followed him. Charles told the family he was going to a friend's house to watch a game, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right with Ethan. He waited 10 minutes before sneaking out and hopping onto his bike. Staying at a safe distance, he trailed his father's car as it wound its way to the edge of town. Charles parked near an abandoned warehouse, and Ethan watched from the shadows as his father slipped inside. Ethan crept closer, peering through a broken window. Inside, Charles was meeting with a group of men. Ethan couldn't hear much of their conversation, but one phrase cut through the static of his fear. "The shipment will be ready by Friday. We can't afford any loose ends." That was the night Ethan realized his father wasn't the man he thought he was. For weeks, Ethan wrestled with the truth. He didn't know who to trust. Should he confront his father? Tell his mother? Go to the police? He spent hours pacing his room, replaying the scene at the warehouse in his mind. Every time he saw his father's face at the dinner table, laughing and joking as if nothing was wrong, Ethan's stomach turned. His breaking point came when he overheard a hushed phone call between his parents. Charles was in the living room, and Margaret stood in the kitchen, trying to keep her voice low. "I told you it's too risky," she whispered harshly. "What if Ethan finds out? He's not a little kid anymore, Charles. He notices things. You think I don't know that?" Charles snapped. "But we're in too deep now. If I back out, they'll come for all of us." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His mother knew. She was in on it. The morning Ethan decided to go to the police, he left the house early, claiming he had a study session with friends. Instead, he went to the local station and asked to speak with someone about a confidential matter. Detective Harris was assigned to his case. At first, Ethan struggled to explain everything. His voice shook, and his palms were sweaty as he recounted what he had discovered. But as he spoke, the fear started to lift, replaced by a determination he didn't know he had. He handed over the USB drive containing copies of the files he had found on his father's laptop. "This is enough to open an investigation," Detective Harris said. "But Ethan, once we start this, there's no going back." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I just want to do the right thing." Back in the interrogation room, Margaret sat down beside Ethan, her face a mixture of anger and despair. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" she whispered harshly. "I had to, Mom," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Dad's hurting people. I couldn't keep quiet." Before Margaret could respond, Detective Harris re-entered the room, holding a folder. "We just received word from the team sent to the warehouse. They found what your father's been hiding," he said, looking directly at Ethan. "And it's more dangerous than we anticipated." "What did you find?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Harris opened the folder and placed a photo on the table. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a picture of their home, taken from outside the window of Ethan's bedroom. "We believe someone in your father's group knows you've talked," Detective Harris said grimly. "Ethan, your family might be in danger." Ethan's chest tightened as he stared at the photo. It was unmistakably his room, with the blue curtains his mom had bought last summer and his school backpack propped against the corner of the wall. The thought that someone had been outside his house, watching him, made his stomach churn. Margaret grabbed the photo with trembling hands. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "Why would someone? How could they?" Detective Harris folded his arms, his expression cold but focused. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm afraid there's no mistake. Whoever your husband is working with, they've figured out that Ethan has come forward. We need to act quickly to secure your family." Margaret turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing with fury. "You've put us all in danger. Do you even realize what you've done?" "Mom, stop blaming me." Ethan shot back, his voice louder than he intended. "I'm not the one who brought criminals into our lives. Dad did that. I didn't ask for any of this." "Enough," Harris interrupted firmly, holding up a hand. "This isn't the time for family arguments. We're sending officers to your home right now to ensure it's safe. Mrs. Peterson, I need you and Ethan to stay here for now. We'll make arrangements to get you somewhere secure." Margaret looked as though she wanted to argue but bit her lip instead. Ethan sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Every moment felt heavier than the last, and guilt gnawed at him like a relentless shadow. Did he make the right decision? Would his father really have allowed harm to come to people? Or worse, to his own family? The first crack in Charles Peterson's carefully constructed image came years ago, though Ethan didn't see it at the time. It was subtle, his father's growing absences, the increasingly vague explanations for late-night calls, and the sudden influx of expensive gadgets and gifts. Ethan remembered asking his dad once, "How can we afford all this?" Charles had smiled and ruffled his hair. "Hard work and a little luck, buddy. That's all it takes." But now, looking back, Ethan realized the signs were always there. His father's version of hard work wasn't what he had thought. 3 hours passed with no word from Detective Harris. Ethan and Margaret sat in a tense silence in the station's small waiting room. The television in the corner played an old sitcom, the canned laughter sounding hollow and out of place. Margaret's fingers drummed incessantly against the armrest of her chair. Finally, Harris returned, his face grave. He motioned for them to follow him back to the interrogation room. Once inside, he wasted no time getting to the point. "Our officers found more than just evidence at the warehouse," he began. "We believe your husband's associates are preparing to flee the area. But here's the catch. They're not planning to leave empty-handed. They've got something big planned." Margaret's face drained of color. "What do you mean, something big? What's going to happen?" Harris hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We're still piecing things together, but we intercepted a message suggesting they're planning a major hit before disappearing. It's not clear who the target is yet, but the timing lines up with an upcoming charity gala in the city. A gala your husband is supposed to attend? Margaret staggered backward, gripping the edge of the table for support. Ethan clenched his fists. You're saying Dad is, what? A part of this? Or are they targeting him too? We don't know, Harris admitted. What we do know is that he's deeply entangled with these people, and whatever they're planning, it's dangerous. Ethan, do you have any idea where your father might be right now? Ethan shook his head. He didn't come home last night. Mom said he was working late. Margaret cut in, her voice defensive. I didn't know he was involved in anything like this. You can't seriously think I knew about some hit? Harris gave her a measured look. We'll get to that. Right now, our priority is finding Charles and stopping whatever his group is planning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over green meadows, Ethan felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. His father was no longer just a man with secrets, he was a threat. But how much of what Ethan uncovered was the truth? How far had his father gone? And, more importantly, why? That night, while Margaret argued with Harris about their next steps, Ethan sat alone in the waiting room. He stared out the window, the world outside a blur of streetlights and passing cars. A deep part of him still wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way his father could come back from this. But another part, the part that had seen those emails, those blueprints, knew the truth was far uglier. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. Hello? He whispered. A deep, gravelly voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. Ethan, you've made a very big mistake. His throat went dry. Who is this? You know who I am, the voice replied. And you know what happens to people who can't keep their mouths shut. Tell your mom and that detective to back off. If you don't, you'll regret it. The line went dead. Ethan sat frozen, the phone slipping from his trembling hand. He tried to call the number back, but it was blocked. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stumbled back into the interrogation room. Detective Harris, he blurted out, someone just called me. They know. Harris's head snapped up. What do you mean they know? What did they say? They said I made a mistake and that I'll regret it if we don't back off, Ethan stammered. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Harris frowned and grabbed his phone. We need to move you both now. It's not safe here. Before they could leave, a loud explosion shook the station. The lights flickered, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke. Shouts erupted in the hallway as officers scrambled to figure out what was happening. Ethan's heart raced as Harris grabbed his arm. Stay close. We need to get out of here. What's going on? Margaret cried. Harris didn't answer, his focus on guiding them through the chaos. As they reached the back exit, Ethan caught a glimpse of the parking lot through a shattered window. A car was engulfed in flames, sending thick black smoke into the night sky. And pinned to the ground just feet away from the wreckage was a familiar figure. It was Charles. Ethan froze, staring at the scene outside. His father lay motionless on the ground, his face obscured by the thick smoke billowing from the flaming car. Margaret screamed and pushed past Detective Harris, running toward the shattered window. Charles, she cried. Charles. Oh my God, no. Stop her, Harris barked, pulling Margaret back before she could climb through the jagged glass. It's not safe out there. Ethan's legs felt like lead, but his heart hammered in his chest. Was his father dead? Had the explosion been meant for him? Questions tumbled through his mind as Harris called for backup. We need medical assistance and a fire team at the Green Meadow station now. Harris barked into his radio. Possible victim down and unknown hostiles nearby. This could escalate. Margaret broke free from Harris's grip and clutched Ethan tightly, her sobs shaking them both. What have we done? She whispered. Ethan, what have we done? Ethan didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the figure outside as officers swarmed the lot, dousing the flames and securing the area. He wanted to run to his father, to demand answers, but fear rooted him to the spot. It felt like hours before the scene outside was cleared. Harris returned to them, his expression grim. "Your husband is alive," he said, glancing at Margaret, "but he's unconscious and badly injured. We're taking him to the hospital under heavy guard. Whoever planted that explosive wasn't just sending a message. They meant to kill him." Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her face pale. "I need to see him," she said weakly. "He's my husband." "Not yet," Harris said firmly. "Right now, he's our best chance at stopping whatever this group is planning. Once he's stable, I'll question him myself." Margaret turned to Ethan, her eyes wild. "This is all because of you," she snapped. "If you hadn't gone to the police, none of this would be happening." Ethan's chest tightened, and his voice cracked as he replied, "I didn't plant that bomb, Mom. Dad brought this on himself." Harris raised a hand to cut off their argument. "Enough. Blaming each other won't solve anything. We're dealing with dangerous people, and we need to stay focused. I've already arranged for you both to be taken to a safe house." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Harris's sharp look silenced her. "The safe house is non-negotiable," he said. "We don't know if whoever's behind this will try again." Later that night, Ethan and Margaret were whisked away to a secluded cabin miles from town. 2 officers accompanied them, standing guard outside. The isolation only made the tension between mother and son worse. Margaret refused to speak to Ethan, her face a mask of quiet rage. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in his room, staring at the photo of his bedroom window that Harris had shown him earlier. How did it come to this? He thought. He wanted to believe that turning in his father had been the right thing to do, but the cost of his decision was becoming unbearable. His family was falling apart, his father's life hung in the balance, and now their own safety was in question. As the hours dragged on, Ethan's mind returned to the voice on the phone. Whoever had called him wasn't just threatening, they were watching. The next morning, Margaret finally broke her silence. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. Ethan hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to approach. "Mom," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up. "I don't know who you are anymore, Ethan." Her words stung, but he pushed forward. "I did what I thought was right," he said, sitting across from her. "Dad was doing something bad. You know it too. You heard him on the phone." Margaret's gaze finally met his, her eyes filled with tears. "You think I don't know what your father has done? You think I don't lie awake at night wondering when it would all come crashing down? But he's my husband, Ethan. He's your father." Ethan shook his head. "That doesn't make it okay. Mom, he's hurt people. I saw the files. I saw the photos." Margaret's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked up, her voice trembling. "If you knew, why didn't you just come to me? Why did you go to the police?" "Because I didn't think you'd believe me," Ethan said quietly. "And even if you did, what could we have done? I didn't want to lose you too." As the day wore on, the cabin felt smaller and smaller. Ethan paced the living room while Margaret sat in silence, lost in her thoughts. The tension was suffocating. Even the officers outside seemed uneasy, their radios crackling with updates on the ongoing investigation. Just as the sun began to set, there was a knock at the door. One of the officers stepped inside. "Detective Harris is on the line," he said, holding out a satellite phone. Margaret snatched it up before Ethan could react. "Harris? Is Charles okay?" Harris's voice crackled through the speaker. "He's stable for now, but we need to talk. There's been a development." Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the phone. "What kind of development?" "We've traced the group your husband is involved with to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. It's a heavily guarded location, but our informants suggest it's where they're keeping their most important assets, whatever they're planning for the gala. We're moving in tonight." "Good," Margaret said. "Then this will finally be over." Harris hesitated. "Not quite. We also intercepted another message. They're aware of your location. You and Ethan need to move now." Margaret's face drained of color. "What do you mean they know? We're in the middle of nowhere." "They have resources, Margaret," Harris said firmly. "I've already sent a team to extract you. They'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay inside and don't open the door for anyone but my team." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling as she hung up the phone. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaking, "pack your things. We're leaving." Before Ethan could respond, a loud bang echoed outside. The sound of gunfire shattered the stillness of the cabin. The officers guarding the house shouted orders, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He ran to the window, peeking through the curtains just in time to see a masked figure emerge from the woods, holding a rifle. "Get down!" One of the officers yelled as bullets shattered the front window. Ethan hit the floor, his heart pounding as Margaret screamed. The cabin was under attack. Ethan's ears rang as shards of glass rained down around him. The sound of gunfire outside grew louder, punctuated by the shouts of the officers trying to hold their ground. Margaret grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him toward the back of the cabin. "We need to get out of here," she cried, her voice panicked. "What about the officers?" Ethan shouted back. Margaret didn't answer. She shoved him toward the kitchen, where a back door led to the dense woods beyond the property. "Go. Now." Before they could reach the door, the cabin's front door burst open with a deafening crash. One of the officers stumbled inside, bleeding from a wound on his shoulder. "Stay down," he barked, slamming the door shut behind him. He pushed a heavy table against it, trying to barricade the entrance. Margaret ran to him, grabbing a towel from the counter to press against his wound. "What's happening? How many are there?" "Too many," the officer panted, wincing in pain. "They've got us pinned down. Backup's on the way, but we need to hold out until they get here." Ethan peeked around the corner, his heart racing. Through the shattered window, he caught glimpses of figures moving in the trees, their faces obscured by masks. The flash of gun barrels and the crack of bullets were constant, a terrifying rhythm that kept him frozen in place. "Mom, we can't just stay here," he said. "They're going to get in." Margaret looked torn, her eyes darting between Ethan and the injured officer. Before she could respond, another explosion rocked the cabin. The back door flew off its hinges, and two masked men stormed in, their weapons raised. "Get down!" One of them barked, his voice distorted by a voice modulator. Margaret screamed and threw herself over Ethan, shielding him with her body. The injured officer tried to raise his gun, but one of the intruders kicked it out of his hand and shoved him to the floor. "Don't try anything stupid," the second man growled. He turned his attention to Ethan and Margaret, his gaze locking on Ethan. "You're the kid, aren't you? The one who talked." Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was closing up. The man stepped closer, pulling a photo from his pocket. He held it up, and Ethan's heart sank. It was the same photo Detective Harris had shown him, the one of his bedroom window. "We've been keeping an eye on you," the man said. "You should have stayed quiet." Margaret stood up, putting herself between Ethan and the man. "You leave my son alone," she shouted. "He's just a kid." The man sneered. "A kid who caused us a lot of trouble." He raised his weapon, but before he could act, a deafening shot rang out from outside. The man staggered forward, clutching his side, and collapsed to the floor. The second intruder turned toward the window, where one of the officers had managed to take a sniper position in the woods. A second shot followed, and the remaining intruder retreated, dragging his injured partner with him. Margaret pulled Ethan to his feet. "We're not waiting for backup," she said. "We're leaving now." The chaos outside hadn't stopped. The masked men were still exchanging fire with the remaining officers, but the arrival of reinforcements was becoming clear. The rumble of an approaching helicopter and the wail of sirens in the distance signaled that help was finally on its way. Margaret led Ethan out the back, carefully avoiding the wreckage of the door. They ran into the woods, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The trees provided some cover, but every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Ethan flinch. "Where are we going?" he whispered. "Anywhere but here," Margaret said. "We just have to get far enough away until the police can find us." As they moved deeper into the forest, Ethan's mind raced. Who were these people, and how far were they willing to go? He knew his father's involvement had been dangerous, but this was more than he'd ever imagined. Whoever these men were, they were willing to kill to silence him. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret and Ethan stumbled upon an old hunting cabin nestled in a clearing. It looked abandoned, with its weathered wood and broken shutters, but it offered a place to hide. Margaret pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. "Stay close," she whispered, motioning for Ethan to follow. Inside, the air was stale, and the room was sparsely furnished with a rickety table and a few chairs. A single cot sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. Margaret checked the windows, making sure they were locked, while Ethan sat down, his legs trembling from exhaustion. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice shaking. Margaret knelt in front of him, gripping his hands tightly. "We wait." Harris said backup was coming. "They'll find us." "What if they don't?" Ethan whispered. Margaret didn't answer, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Hours passed in tense silence. Every noise outside made them jump, but no one came. The quiet was almost worse than the chaos. Ethan's mind wandered back to his father. Was he still alive? Did he know what was happening to them? As dawn began to break, the sound of approaching footsteps snapped them both to attention. Margaret grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table, holding it tightly as the footsteps grew louder. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside. "Detective Harris?" Margaret gasped, lowering the candlestick. Harris stood in the doorway, his face drawn and weary. Behind him, several officers moved into position around the cabin, securing the area. "You're both safe now," he said. "We've got the area locked down." Ethan let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. But Harris's next words sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over him. "We captured one of the attackers," Harris said grimly. "And according to him, your father wasn't the target tonight." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "They were after you," Harris said, his gaze heavy. "And this isn't over." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "After me," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they be after me?" Detective Harris stepped further into the cabin, glancing at Margaret and then back at Ethan. His expression was stern, but there was a trace of sympathy in his eyes. "Because you're the one who exposed their operation. They know you're a liability." Margaret's face went pale. "He's just a kid," she said, her voice trembling. "Why would they go this far?" Harris sighed. "These people don't care about age or innocence. They only care about protecting themselves." Ethan jeopardized their plans, and now they see him as a threat that needs to be eliminated. Margaret clenched her fists, anger and fear warring on her face. "You have to protect him. You promised us that you'd keep us safe." "We're doing everything we can," Harris said. "The safe house wasn't secure enough. I'll personally oversee your relocation to a more secure facility, but we need to act fast." Ethan sat silently, his thoughts swirling. He had never imagined that standing up for what was right could spiral so far out of control. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating. His father's secrets had turned his life into a nightmare, and now his family was paying the price. The car ride to the new safe house was tense and silent. Harris drove, flanked by two unmarked police cars for protection. Margaret sat in the back seat, gripping Ethan's hand tightly as if letting go might somehow make him disappear. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence. "To a secure facility on the outskirts of the city," Harris replied without taking his eyes off the road. "It's equipped with surveillance, reinforced barriers, and a dedicated team of guards. No one will get to you there." Ethan stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. The question he had been avoiding finally escaped his lips. "What's going to happen to Dad?" Harris glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "He's still under heavy guard at the hospital. Once he's stable enough to talk, we'll interrogate him. Hopefully, he can give us the information we need to dismantle this group. And if he doesn't," Ethan pressed. Harris's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have to find another way." The new safe house was a stark contrast to the cozy cabin they had left behind. It was a sprawling concrete building surrounded by a tall, barbed wire fence. Security cameras dotted the perimeter, and armed guards patrolled the grounds. It felt more like a fortress than a home. Ethan and Margaret were ushered inside by Harris and his team. The interior was cold and sterile, with bare walls and minimal furnishings. They were shown to their quarters, a small suite with a single bedroom and a living area. It was safe, but it didn't feel welcoming. As the guards set up their stations, Harris pulled Margaret aside. Ethan pretended not to notice, but he couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. "They're escalating," Harris said. "We intercepted another message. They've doubled down on their efforts to silence the boy." Margaret's voice shook. "What does that mean? Are they going to try again?" "It's likely," Harris admitted, "but we're prepared this time. They won't get through." Margaret didn't look reassured. Her gaze drifted to Ethan, who quickly looked away, pretending to study the walls. Later that night, Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the safe house was oppressive, every creak and rustle amplified in the stillness. His mind raced with questions and fears. What if the men came back? What if they succeeded this time? Unable to sleep, he got up and walked to the small kitchenette where Margaret sat nursing a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No. You?" Margaret sighed. "Not really. It's hard to sleep when," she trailed off, her gaze dropping to her tea. "When everything feels like it's falling apart?" Ethan finished for her. She nodded, and they sat in silence for a while. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Do you think we'll ever go back to normal?" Ethan thought about the life they had before his father's secrets unraveled. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I hope so." Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. "Me too." The next day, Harris returned with news. "Your father's awake," he said, addressing both Ethan and Margaret. "And he's ready to talk?" Margaret's face lit up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Can we see him?" "Not yet," Harris said. "He's under strict surveillance. But he's agreed to provide information in exchange for protection. If he cooperates, we might be able to take down this group once and for all." Ethan's stomach churned. He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face his father. The man who had always seemed like a hero to him was now a stranger with dangerous secrets. That evening, Harris returned with an update that sent shockwaves through the safe house. "Your father gave us a lead," he said, his expression tense. "The group is planning something bigger than we thought. It's not just the gala they're targeting." Margaret's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "They're planning coordinated attacks across multiple locations," Harris explained. "The gala is just the centerpiece. If they succeed, the damage will be catastrophic." Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him. "Why would Dad help them plan something like that?" he asked. Harris's gaze was steady. "We believe your father was forced into this. But whether he was a willing participant or not, the fact remains. He has information we need to stop this." Margaret looked desperate. "What do we do now?" "We move fast," Harris said. "Your father's information is incomplete, but it's a start. We've already dispatched teams to intercept their operatives, but we need to be ready for anything." As the safe house settled into a tense rhythm, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The guards seemed more on edge, their movements sharper and more deliberate. He overheard snippets of their conversations. Words like breach, compromised, and protocol. That night, just as the lights dimmed and the safe house fell quiet, Ethan heard it. A low, metallic scraping sound coming from the air vent above his bed. He froze, his heart pounding as he stared at the vent. The sound grew louder, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Swallowing hard, he reached for the lamp on his bedside table, his fingers trembling. Then, with a deafening crash, the vent cover fell to the floor. Ethan scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed as the vent cover clattered loudly to the floor. His wide eyes stayed fixed on the dark opening above. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that made every second stretch unbearably. Then a hand emerged. It was gloved, reaching out cautiously, feeling for support as the intruder began to climb down. Ethan's voice caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but fear held him captive. He forced himself to move, rolling off the bed and darting toward the door. The figure dropped down with a soft thud. "Don't move," a low, distorted voice ordered. Ethan froze mid-step. He didn't dare turn around, but he could hear the faint rustle of clothing and the heavy breathing of the intruder. His mind raced. Where were the guards? Where was his mom? How had this person gotten inside? Hands where I can see them, the voice commanded. Ethan slowly raised his hands, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could feel the intruder's presence creeping closer. A metallic click echoed through the room, a gun being cocked. "You've caused a lot of trouble, kid," the voice growled. "But it ends here." Before the intruder could say anything else, a deafening alarm blared throughout the safe house. Red emergency lights flooded the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sudden chaos startled the intruder, who whipped around toward the door just as it burst open. "Drop the weapon," one of the guards shouted, his rifle trained on the masked figure. The intruder hesitated, his grip tightening on the pistol in his hand. Ethan dove to the floor, shielding his head as gunfire erupted. The room filled with the deafening noise of bullets ricocheting off the walls. The guards shouted commands, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Ethan felt hands grab him and pull him out of the room. He looked up to see his mother, her face pale and terrified. "Come on," she cried, dragging him down the hallway. The safe house was a war zone. Alarms blared, and armed intruders swarmed the building. Gunfire echoed through the halls as guards and attackers exchanged shots. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see. Ethan and Margaret crouched low as they followed Harris, who was barking orders into his radio. "We're breached," Harris shouted. "Team Alpha, secure the main entrance. Team Bravo, move to the evac point." Margaret clutched Ethan's arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin. "What's happening? How did they find us?" she demanded. "They've got resources we underestimated," Harris said grimly. "We need to get you out of here now." They rounded a corner and nearly ran into another guard, who was holding his side where blood seeped through his uniform. "The evac route's compromised," the guard panted. "They're everywhere." Harris swore under his breath. "We'll take the service tunnel. It's our only shot." The service tunnel was a narrow, dimly lit passage that ran beneath the safe house. Harris led the way, his gun drawn, while Margaret and Ethan followed closely behind. The sound of gunfire above them grew fainter, but it did little to ease the tension. Ethan's mind reeled. This wasn't supposed to happen. The safe house had been their sanctuary, a place where they were supposed to be untouchable. But now it was clear that nowhere was truly safe. "What if they're waiting for us at the other end?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. "They won't be," Harris said. "This tunnel isn't on any blueprint they could have gotten their hands on." "How can you be so sure?" Margaret pressed. Harris didn't answer, and Ethan could see the doubt flicker across his face. They reached the end of the tunnel, where a metal ladder led up to a hatch. Harris motioned for them to stay back as he climbed up, his movements cautious. He pushed the hatch open slowly, peering out before stepping aside to signal the others. "It's clear," he whispered. "Come on." Ethan climbed up first, pulling himself through the hatch and onto the damp ground above. They were in a wooded area, the dense trees providing cover. The night air was cool, and the faint sound of sirens carried from the direction of the safe house. Margaret emerged next, followed by Harris. They moved quickly, staying low as they made their way through the forest. Harris's radio crackled to life, and a voice came through. "Detective Harris, do you copy? This is Team Alpha. We've secured the remaining hostiles, but they had reinforcements outside the perimeter. We're pursuing." "Understood," Harris replied. "We've exited through the tunnel and are heading to the secondary evac point." "Roger that. Be advised, the leader of the group wasn't among those captured. He may still be in the area." Harris's jaw tightened. "Understood. Keep me updated." They reached a clearing where a black SUV waited, its engine idling. A driver stepped out, nodding to Harris. "Detective, the evac point is secure. We can move now." Harris ushered Margaret and Ethan into the vehicle, then climbed into the passenger seat. As the SUV pulled away, Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe. The immediate danger was behind them, for now. Margaret leaned back in her seat, her hands shaking as she rubbed her temples. "How much more of this can we take?" she muttered. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," Harris admitted. "Not until we take them down completely. But we're getting closer." Your husband's intel has given us an edge. Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts heavy. The image of the intruder climbing through the vent replayed in his mind. Who are these people? He asked. What do they want? They're a criminal syndicate, Harris said. Smuggling, extortion, blackmail, you name it, they're involved. Your father got tangled up with them years ago, but now that he's trying to turn on them, they see you and your family as collateral damage. Ethan clenched his fists. We have to stop them. Harris glanced at him. We will. But it's going to take time. Just as they began to relax, the driver slammed on the brakes. The SUV skidded to a stop, throwing everyone forward in their seats. What's wrong? Harris barked. The driver pointed ahead, his face pale. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure dressed in black, holding a weapon aimed directly at the SUV. Harris reached for his gun. Stay down, he ordered as the figure raised the weapon and fired. The windshield shattered with a deafening crack as the first bullet struck. The driver slumped forward, blood spilling from his chest. Margaret screamed, pulling Ethan down behind the seats as Harris dove for cover, drawing his weapon. Stay low, Harris barked, returning fire through the broken glass. The SUV offered little protection, and the sound of bullets ricocheting off the metal frame filled the air. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he clutched his mother. What do we do? He shouted over the chaos. Harris fired again, his face set with grim determination. We need to move. On my signal. Get out and head for the trees. Margaret's eyes widened. What? We'll be sitting ducks out there. If we stay here, we're dead, Harris snapped. He peeked over the dashboard, firing another shot before turning back to them. Ready? Go. He threw open the passenger door and leapt out, his gun blazing. Ethan grabbed Margaret's hand and followed, ducking low as they sprinted toward the woods. The sound of gunfire chased them, branches snapping overhead as bullets tore through the trees. Ethan's legs burned as he pushed himself forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Margaret stumbled behind him, her grip on his hand tightening as she struggled to keep up. Harris stayed close, covering their retreat with sharp, precise shots. They didn't stop running until the gunfire faded into the distance. Ethan collapsed against a tree, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Margaret sank to the ground beside him, her face pale and streaked with tears. Harris crouched nearby, scanning the forest with sharp eyes. They won't be far behind, he said grimly. We need to keep moving. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, his voice trembling. Who was that? How did they know where we were? They've been tracking us, Harris said. Your father warned us they'd stop at nothing. Looks like he was right. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. This is insane. We can't keep running like this. What are we supposed to do? Harris's expression softened slightly. We'll figure it out. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. Ethan looked at him, his voice bitter. Safe? There's no such thing anymore. The group pressed on, moving deeper into the forest. The air was thick and humid, the dense canopy of trees blocking out most of the fading sunlight. Every crackle of leaves or snap of a twig made Ethan flinch, his nerves stretched to their limit. Harris led the way, his gun at the ready. There's an old ranger station about 2 miles from here, he said. It's abandoned, but it'll give us a place to regroup. Margaret's steps faltered. 2 miles? I don't know if I can. You can, Harris interrupted firmly. You have to. They walked in tense silence, the oppressive quiet of the forest broken only by their labored breathing. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the masked figure from the road emerging from the shadows. When they finally reached the ranger station, it was barely more than a small, weathered shack. The windows were boarded up, and the wooden walls were covered in moss. Harris pushed open the door cautiously, sweeping the room with his gun before motioning for the others to enter. It's not much, he admitted, but it'll do. Ethan collapsed onto an old, dusty bench, his body aching from the relentless tension. Margaret sat beside him, her face drawn and exhausted. Harris began securing the room, checking the doors and windows before positioning himself near the entrance. We can rest here for a little while, he said, but we need to keep our guard up. Margaret shook her head. I don't understand how it came to this. Charles knew these people were dangerous. Why didn't he just walk away? Ethan stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Maybe he thought he could handle it. Or maybe he didn't care what happened to us. Don't say that, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Your father loves you. Does he? Ethan shot back, his voice rising. Because it doesn't feel like it. All of this, everything we've been through, it's because of him. Harris cut in before the argument could escalate. This isn't the time for that. Right now, we need to focus on surviving. Hours passed, the silence in the ranger station heavy with unspoken fears. Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the masked figure from the road, the shattered windshield, the driver slumping forward. He felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, suffocating. Margaret dozed fitfully, her head resting on the bench. Harris stayed awake, his gun resting on his lap as he kept watch. Ethan finally broke the silence. Do you think they'll find us? He asked quietly. Harris didn't look at him. I don't know. Ethan hesitated. Do you think my dad knew this would happen? Harris finally turned to him, his expression unreadable. I think your father made some bad choices, but I also think he's trying to fix them now. Whether it's enough, I can't say. Before Ethan could respond, a faint noise outside made Harris sit up straight. He motioned for silence, his body tense as he moved toward the door. The sound came again, a low rustling, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Harris glanced back at Ethan and Margaret, his voice low. Stay here. Don't make a sound. He slipped out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan and Margaret sat frozen, their breaths shallow as they listened. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, the door burst open. A masked figure stood in the doorway, their weapon aimed directly at Ethan. Ethan's heart stopped as the masked figure stepped into the room, the barrel of the gun gleaming in the dim light. Margaret screamed, pulling him behind her, her body trembling as she shielded him with her own. Don't move, the figure growled, their distorted voice echoing in the small space. Margaret's voice quivered. Please, don't hurt him. He's just a boy. The intruder ignored her, their attention locked on Ethan. You've caused us more trouble than you're worth, kid. But it ends now. Ethan's mind raced. His eyes darted to the gun in the intruder's hand, then to his mother, who was trembling but steadfast in her position between them. He had never felt more helpless. Just as the intruder took a step closer, a single, deafening gunshot rang out. The masked figure staggered, dropping their weapon as blood spread across their shoulder. Harris appeared in the doorway, his gun raised and his face cold with fury. Drop now, Harris barked. The intruder collapsed to their knees, clutching their shoulder. Harris kicked the gun out of reach, keeping his weapon trained on them. Margaret sobbed in relief, pulling Ethan into a tight embrace. You okay? Harris asked, his voice steady but sharp. Ethan nodded, his body shaking. Yeah, I think so. Mom! Ethan shouted suddenly. Are you hurt? Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I'm okay. Harris stepped closer to the intruder, grabbing them by the arm and hauling them to their feet. Who sent you? He demanded. The figure chuckled darkly, their voice strained from the pain. You already know the answer to that. Harris tightened his grip. You're going to tell me everything, or I'll make sure you regret stepping foot in here. The intruder smirked beneath their mask. It doesn't matter what you do to me. You'll never stop them. The intruder was bound and secured in the corner of the room, their shoulder wound hastily bandaged by Harris. Margaret and Ethan sat huddled together, their eyes darting nervously toward the captive every few moments. Harris paced the room, his gun still in his hand. We don't have much time, he said, glancing out the window. Where there's one, there's more. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. What do we do? We stick to the plan, Harris replied. We move to the next evac point and regroup. But first, he turned to the captive, his expression hard. We need answers. The intruder chuckled again, leaning back against the wall despite the pain in their shoulder. You're wasting your time. Who sent you? Harris asked, stepping closer. You already know. the figure said, their voice laced with defiance. But you're too late. The gala isn't the only thing they're targeting. By the time you figure it out, it'll all be over. Ethan's stomach sank. What do you mean? What else are they targeting? The intruder turned their head toward Ethan, their masked face tilting slightly. You'll find out soon enough, kid. Harris knelt in front of the intruder, his voice low and dangerous. Tell me what you know, or I swear you'll regret it. The figure's smirk faltered for a moment, but they didn't speak. Harris sighed, standing up and shaking his head. Fine. We'll see how tough you are when you're locked in a cell. As dawn broke, Harris tied the intruder's hands behind their back and secured them in the SUV they'd used to travel to the ranger station. Margaret and Ethan climbed into the back seat, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Where are we going now? Margaret asked. To a secure staging area, Harris replied. We'll interrogate our friend here properly and figure out our next move. The drive was tense and silent. Harris kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning for any signs of pursuit. Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He couldn't shake the intruder's words. What else were they planning? Could it really be worse than the gala? They reached the staging area, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Harris ushered them inside, where a team of officers and agents was already waiting. The intruder was taken into custody, their mask removed to reveal a middle-aged man with sharp features and cold eyes. Start the interrogation, Harris ordered, handing the man over to the agents. I want to know everything. Ethan and Margaret were led to a small, private room where they could wait. Margaret sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Ethan sat beside her, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. Do you think they'll talk? Ethan asked. They have to, Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Hours passed with no word from Harris or the agents. The waiting was agonizing, every minute stretching endlessly. Ethan's mind wandered back to his father. He wanted to hate him for what he had done, but part of him still hoped that Charles had acted out of desperation, not malice. Finally, Harris returned, his face grim. We've got a lead, he said. But it's worse than we thought. What do you mean? Margaret asked, standing up quickly. They're targeting multiple locations, Harris explained. And they're moving faster than we anticipated. We don't have much time to stop them. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Where are they targeting? Harris hesitated, then looked directly at Ethan. One of the targets is your father's hospital, Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Ethan's blood ran cold. Dad's in danger? Harris nodded. They see him as a traitor. If they get to him before we do, they'll kill him. Ethan's heart pounded as he looked at his mother, then back at Harris. Then we have to stop them. Harris's jaw tightened. We will. But we need to move now. The air in the SUV was thick with tension as Harris drove toward the hospital. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. Margaret sat in the back seat, her hands trembling as she gripped Ethan's arm. This is insane, she whispered. How did it come to this? How did our lives fall apart so quickly? Ethan didn't answer. He stared out the window, his mind racing. His father's hospital was a high-security facility, but if the syndicate was as ruthless and resourceful as Harris claimed, no amount of security would stop them. The thought of losing his father, despite everything, gnawed at him. Harris's voice cut through the silence. We'll be there in 10 minutes. I've already called in a team to secure the hospital, but I can't promise we'll get there before they do. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. What if we're too late? Harris's grip on the steering wheel tightened. We won't be. When they arrived, the hospital was a scene of controlled chaos. Police cars surrounded the building, their lights flashing. Officers armed with rifles patrolled the perimeter, while hospital staff and patients were evacuated in a hurried but orderly fashion. Harris parked the SUV near the entrance and turned to Margaret and Ethan. Stay close to me. Don't wander off and don't make yourselves a target. Margaret nodded, her face pale. We just need to get Charles out of here. That's the plan, Harris said. But be prepared. These people aren't afraid to get messy. Inside, the hospital was eerily quiet. Most of the patients had been moved to safer locations, leaving the hallways empty except for a few staff members and officers. Harris led them toward the intensive care unit, where Charles was being guarded by a small team of police. When they reached the room, Ethan was shocked by what he saw. His father lay in a hospital bed, pale and hooked up to machines. The once imposing man who had dominated their household now looked fragile, almost unrecognizable. Margaret rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Charles! Oh my God!" Charles's eyes fluttered open, and his gaze settled on Margaret. "You shouldn't be here," he croaked, his voice weak. "We had no choice," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "They're coming for you, Charles. They're trying to kill you." Charles grimaced, his expression a mix of pain and regret. I told you this would happen if I talked." Harris stepped forward. "You did the right thing, but now we need to get you out of here. Do you know what they're planning?" Charles nodded faintly. "It's bigger than the gala. They're using it as a distraction. Their real target is." Before he could finish, the sound of gunfire erupted from the hallway. Harris drew his gun, his body tensing. "Stay here," he barked, motioning for the officers in the room to cover the door. He opened it cautiously, peering out to assess the situation. Ethan and Margaret huddled near Charles's bed, fear gripping them. The gunfire grew louder, accompanied by shouting and the heavy thud of boots on the tiled floor. "They're here," Charles whispered. "You need to go." "We're not leaving you," Margaret said firmly. Harris stepped back into the room, his face grim. "They've breached the building. We're moving now." Two officers moved to Charles's bed, unhooking him from the machines and transferring him to a wheelchair. He groaned in pain but didn't protest. Harris led the way, his gun at the ready, while the officers pushed Charles toward the service elevator. The elevator ride was agonizingly slow. Ethan could hear the chaos growing closer, the gunfire, the shouting, the pounding of footsteps. He clenched his fists, his heart racing. When the elevator doors finally opened, they stepped into a dimly lit parking garage. Harris signaled for the group to stay close as they moved toward an unmarked van parked near the exit. "Get in," Harris ordered, motioning for the officers to load Charles into the back. Margaret climbed in after him, followed by Ethan. Just as Harris was about to close the doors, a figure appeared at the entrance to the garage. It was a man in a black tactical vest, his face obscured by a mask. He raised a weapon, and Harris dove for cover, shouting, "Go! Now!" The driver hit the gas, and the van sped toward the exit. Bullets ricocheted off the sides as the masked man opened fire. Margaret screamed, pulling Ethan down and shielding him with her body. Charles groaned in pain, clutching his side. Harris returned fire, his shots forcing the attacker to dive for cover. The van skidded around a corner, the tires screeching as it raced out of the garage and onto the street. Ethan sat up, his body trembling. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. Margaret nodded, though tears streamed down her face. Charles looked pale, his breathing labored. Harris climbed into the van, slamming the door shut. "They'll be on our tail," he said. "We need to lose them." The van weaved through the city streets, the driver taking sharp turns and speeding through red lights. Ethan glanced out the back window and saw headlights in the distance, several cars chasing them. "They're coming," he said, panic rising in his voice. "I see them," Harris replied, pulling out his phone. "Backup is on the way. We just need to hold them off." The chase intensified, the cars behind them closing the distance. Harris handed a rifle to one of the officers in the van. "Take out their tires," he ordered. The officer leaned out the back window, aiming carefully before firing. The lead car swerved, its tire blown, and crashed into a lamppost. But the others kept coming. Ethan's chest tightened as the van lurched forward, narrowly avoiding a collision with a truck. Margaret held him close, whispering prayers under her breath. As they approached a deserted industrial area, Harris gave the driver a sharp command. "Turn here. We'll make our stand." The van screeched to a halt, and everyone piled out. Harris motioned for the group to take cover behind a stack of shipping containers. The sound of approaching engines filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Get ready," Harris said, his voice cold and steady. "This ends here." The engines roared louder, the headlights of the pursuing cars cutting through the darkness. Ethan huddled behind a container with Margaret and Charles, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Harris and the officers spread out, taking defensive positions as the cars skidded to a stop a few hundred feet away. From the shadows, masked figures emerged, their weapons drawn. The leader, a tall man with a deep scar running down his face, stepped forward. He carried himself with a chilling calm, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Hand over the boy and the traitor," he said, pointing toward Charles and Ethan. "Do that, and no one else has to die." Harris stepped out of cover, his gun aimed squarely at the leader. "It's over," he said firmly. "Your operation's been exposed. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see a courtroom." The scarred man chuckled. "You think you've won? You think taking me down will stop this? We're bigger than you can imagine. You're running out of places to hide," Harris shot back. "And we've got your people talking." The leader's smirk faltered for a moment before he motioned to his men. "Take them." Gunfire erupted, lighting up the night as both sides exchanged shots. The sharp cracks of bullets echoed through the industrial lot. Harris's team held their ground, their training and precision keeping the attackers at bay, but the syndicate's sheer numbers threatened to overwhelm them. Ethan crouched low, his hands over his ears as the chaos unfolded around him. Margaret clung to Charles, who was too weak to do anything but watch. Ethan's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and there was no telling if reinforcements would arrive in time. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. He remembered seeing a control panel near the entrance to the lot, a control box for the industrial floodlights that dotted the area. If he could get to it, he might be able to blind the attackers and give Harris's team an advantage. "I have to do something," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Ethan, no. It's too dangerous. If I don't, we're not getting out of this," he said, his voice firm. Before she could stop him, Ethan darted out from behind the container, keeping low as he ran toward the control panel. Bullets whizzed past him, and his heart felt like it might explode. He reached the panel and frantically flipped the switches. The floodlights roared to life, blindingly bright. The attackers shouted in confusion, shielding their eyes. Harris and his team seized the opportunity, advancing with precision. One by one, the attackers were subdued, their weapons kicked away as they were forced to the ground. Ethan ducked behind the control panel, watching as the tide of the battle shifted. Relief washed over him as Harris's voice boomed through the lot. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." The scarred leader glared at Harris, his gun still raised. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, but the sound of approaching sirens made him reconsider. With a snarl, he threw his gun to the ground, raising his hands. "It's not over," he growled. "You'll never stop us." Harris stepped forward, his gun still trained on the man. "Maybe not," he said, "but you're done." The aftermath was a blur of activity. The remaining attackers were handcuffed and loaded into police vehicles. Harris's team swept the area, ensuring no one had slipped through their net. Margaret and Charles were escorted to an ambulance, where paramedics began treating Charles's injuries. Ethan stood off to the side, watching as the chaos finally began to subside. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Harris, his expression softening. "You did good, kid," Harris said. "That was brave." Ethan nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his stomach. "Is it really over?" "For now," Harris said. "We've taken down their leader, and your father's testimony will help us dismantle the rest of the organization. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." Days later, Ethan, Margaret, and Charles were relocated to a new safe house, far from Green Meadows. Charles agreed to enter witness protection, his testimony critical to the investigation. Though his actions had put his family in danger, it was clear he was determined to make amends. "I'm sorry," Charles said one night, his voice thick with emotion. "I let you down. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong." Margaret placed a hand on his. "We'll get through this. Together." Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive, but he knew they couldn't move forward without trying. As the weeks passed, the danger began to fade, though the scars remained. Ethan struggled to adjust to the new normal, but he found strength in the bond he shared with his mother. He knew their lives would never be the same, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. One evening, Harris visited the safe house to deliver an update. "The syndicate's been dismantled," he said. "We've made dozens of arrests, and with your father's help, we've cut off their resources." Margaret sighed in relief. "Thank God." Harris looked at Ethan. "You made a difference. Don't ever forget that." As Harris left, Ethan stood at the window, staring out at the quiet street. The weight of what had happened still lingered, but he felt stronger for having faced it. He turned to his parents and managed a small smile. "Maybe we can finally start over." For the first time in a long time, Margaret and Charles smiled back. The fight was over, but their story wasn't. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild, together.